Hello, this is Kerry Martell, editor for the Yamhill Advocate, and I am here with Angela Plowhead, who is currently running for a political position here in the state of Oregon. She's running for Congress, as I understand it. Thank you for sitting down with me, Angela.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kerry.
So tell the readership of the Advocate a little about yourself and why you're running for position.
Yeah, so I am a veteran. I was an intelligence analyst in the Air Force. I completed my degree, and then after I got out, I went to George Fox and got my doctorate in clinical psychology. It was still really imperative to me that I serve veterans, and so I did that in VA for about 12 years in different capacities. Then I opened a private practice, left VA, and continued to serve my community as a business owner and an advocate for seniors and people with disabilities through different community agencies and doing lots of advocacy work at legislature, doing policy and budgeting kinds of things at the county level. The organization I worked with had 5 different counties that were under it. And so, a lot of the work that I have done has been in the federal government. So a lot of my experiences and expertise have to do with federal issues. So that's why I'm running for Congress. Right now, there's a lot going on in our state and in our nation. And when I saw Portland literally in flames, with the riots and what was happening there, with the lack of accountability and seeing our elected leaders implement strategies on our populace that were strategies I had only ever seen happen in communistic or dictatorial type regimes, that was really concerning to me. And I knew it was time for me to step up and do something about it.
Tell us, what exactly do you think you can do about it? What would you seek to do if you were elected to Congress?
So a lot of the things really have to do with our Constitution, getting us back to original intent of our Constitution, which is less federal government, more states' rights, more individual rights, making sure that our Constitution is preserved, that our freedoms and liberties are preserved, and that when we look at all the other issues that we're having today, much of it goes back to that. So that, the purpose of the federal government is to protect our nation militarily and in many other ways, but primarily militarily. And so when I'm looking at a lot of the issues that we're having right now, they're issues regarding our intelligence community, issues regarding our national sovereignty and our national security related to, what's happening at the border, but also related to internationally what's happening. It started essentially with Afghanistan and, the botched withdrawal there, to include sharing of our national secrets with our enemy, and endangering our intelligence sources that were on the ground, endangering our friendlies, and endangering our military. And we all know that from that, we ended up having 13 military deaths that could have absolutely been avoided. And now we're going to have to deal for decades with the intelligence that was left on the ground and the billions of dollars of equipment that we're not only going to be fighting, but now having to combat the intelligence secrets that were left for the Taliban to then not only utilize, but then share with China and Russia, and, untold other enemies of our nation. And now it's continued on, and we're seeing a progression of that because of the lack of strength that we've portrayed with this current administration, that now we've ended up with a situation with the Ukraine and Russia. So, there's a lot happening internationally that I think having someone with my background and experience would be very useful in helping to guide our military actions. And what happens with our intelligence community that has been lacking. You know, right now we have the fewest number of veterans in Congress that we've had since World War II. So we have people directing our intelligence agencies that have no background or experience in what that community does and how it does it. And we're seeing a lot of failures.
Yeah, that does sound very distressing to me. On your campaign flyer that I have in my hand, you have 4 basic issues that your campaign is focused on. I'd like to talk,
Yeah.
a little bit more about that. Those issues are restore fundamental liberties,
Mhm,
reform education,
mhm,
restore safe communities, and
mhm.
reinvigorate our economy. Could you elaborate on each one, starting with what you mean by restoring fundamental liberties?
Absolutely. So, you know, when it comes to, and we've already talked a little bit about some of that, but when it comes to our fundamental liberties, you know, our Constitution gives us the right to freedom of speech. And right now we have seen the narrative in our nation be controlled by one side, where any opposite view or any opposing view gets canceled. And that has been very detrimental. You know, part of how we as a nation grow and um, how anyone grows is by having alternative views that you can look at and then make some decisions about. But like what happened with COVID was there was one narrative about what should happen, and instead of being informed by science, even though we were hearing the term follow the science, what was actually happening was that the the science that was paid attention to was the science that fit the narrative instead of looking at everything. Um, where to the point where we were seeing physicians being um, censured by their board and losing their license because of providing medications to patients that were actually saving them. And then we had the FDA and the CDC say that those medications could not be used all at the same time while giving $32 billion to Big Pharma to develop a similar medication. So there's absolutely some conflicts of interest in that. And I think we as a nation need to have some accountability for those organizations for all the deaths that were experienced in America and around the world because of those actions. And that's just one example of that First Amendment piece. You know, we see that all the time in the media where, you know, if that dialogue is not allowed to happen, then we end up with state-sponsored media, and we actually have our president having said through his press secretary that they were telling the media what to say. And that's not where we should be in America. You know, we need to preserve our Second Amendment rights.
I agree. The Second Amendment is a very important right that really
Yeah,
defines, American liberty and
absolutely.
protect it. Let's talk now about the issue of reform education and what you think is really important
Yeah.
for
Well, there's a
reform.
couple of other things in the fundamental liberties. Do you mind if we talk about
For
those
sure,
just real briefly?
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so, you know, what happening was with the mandates with bodily autonomy, people being able to choose their medical care instead of that being dictated by the state or the federal government, absolutely goes along with that. Also, you know, issues related to our fundamental liberties are what's been happening with election integrity. You know, people need to have confidence that when they vote, that their vote is going to be counted. And right now, 83% of Americans do not feel that that's the case.
That's a large number.
It is a large number, and one that I think we need to pay attention to. And really, when we're talking about doing election reforms, I think we need to be talking about that in terms of making sure that every vote is counted and that legal votes are counted and that there isn't cheating happening, which, like I said, 83% of Americans feel like there has been cheating. So education reform, absolutely. And when I think everything goes back to the freedoms that we get from the Constitution. So part of this, when I think about education and I think about reform to education, it comes down to individual rights. So, as a nation, we've decided that we want to invest in education. We feel like it's important, that it readies our nation and it readies our children to go on and then become leaders. But they can't do that if they're not being expected to have academic excellence. And right now, academic excellence has really been attacked. And so we've seen that with the lowering of standards. When our school system has failed, instead of changing the system to actually meet the standard, they've lowered the standard. And that will only lead to further failure for our nation and for our children, who are not able to compete even in the state. When you have 50% or almost 50% of our students that are having to take remedial classes just to take 100 level college courses.
By reducing the standards, you're referring to the recent bill that the Democrats passed here in Oregon and that Kate Brown signed in, that basically removed the requirement to pass tests for reading and math in order to
Yes.
graduate from high school.
Yeah, absolutely. And so instead of raising the bar and helping kids rise to that bar, you're removing the bar at all. And so there's this condition called regression to the mean in psychology, where we talk about how when you take a bunch of people and you put them in a room and you have people that are performing just kind of at the kind of average level and you have high performers, what tends to happen is that those high performers tend to regress down to that more middle standard. But when you obliterate the standard and there is no longer a standard, there's no bar for anyone to rise up to.
As you probably are aware, the Yamhill Advocate has been doing a lot of reporting on what we call the Newberg school saga. Do you have an opinion about the matter and the topic? I see on your flyer you have a couple things that are kind of relevant to it, such as removing divisive politics and false history in the hypersexualization of children from the classroom, and return to teaching the basics, focus on preparing our children for the future. Are you willing to elaborate further on your views on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been very open about all of these things. I've talked about them quite a lot. I was very active and a vocal supporter of preventing the recalls that were happening there in Newberg. When I talk about false history, I'm talking about things like the 1619 Project, which promotes a false history that history professors and American history experts have denoted as not being true or accurate. When we have things like CRT in the classroom, and I know that the Department of Education and the school boards will say we don't teach CRT, but when you're trying to segregate children and promote a ideology that says that one race is more important, or that one race, absolutely cannot be promoted where another one can, then that to me, as a biracial person, is very problematic. If I would have gotten the message that I was a victim and that I had no hope of success in my life, then that would have been so demotivating. We need to be teaching our children is that they are all overcomers, that they all have special gifts and talents that can be utilized to help them, help their communities, and help our nation. And so if we promote a message of hope versus a message of demoralization, then we're going to get the best out of our children. I know, most people can point to, that one teacher or coach or that someone in their lives that gave them some belief in themselves that helped them to move forward. And if they didn't have that, what we see are really horrible things in people's outcomes. And so if they didn't have that internal drive to just succeed on their own. And so most people need that kind of help. And when you have an entire system telling people that you're an oppressor and you need to be move yourself out of the way to allow someone else to move up, then you're harming both sides. You're not helping either one.
I agree. I
And
think the pursuit of excellence is what the school should be focusing on, not providing kids illicit excuses for why they failed, especially when those excuses have to do with blaming everybody else for frivolous, sometimes often nonsensical things like that person was a dude. So the next is restore safe communities. You have on
well,
here.
yeah, and you talked about reforming education. I think part of reforming education and pulling it back to our Constitution and our freedoms is school choice. If a parent likes what their school is teaching, that's great, that's fine. They should have the choice to send their kid there, but it shouldn't just be the elite that have the opportunity to take their children out and move them to a school that does have academic excellence, or that maybe focuses on science or biology or whatever it is that their kid excels in. I didn't have anyone advocating for me in my education, in how I grew up. And so and my parents, we were very poor. My parents didn't have the money to send me to a private school. My husband and I are very fortunate in that we were able to take our child, one of our children anyway, out of public school and put him in private school because of the issues he was facing in the public education realm. And then he excelled, been an AB honor roll student ever since. But it shouldn't just be the parents who have the money to do that. Every parent and every child should have that opportunity.
So you support school choice charter school structure.
I do, and I support the money following the child, not the other way around. I think adding some competition into the schools, where not eliminating public schools by any means, but giving more incentive to actually compete for the students by it would give more drive for academic excellence versus some of these other things that are taking schools away from that focus.
The next thing was restore safe communities. You have on here the importance of securing the border, rebuilding our national defense, and strengthening the position of our military and law enforcement through the removing of destructive politicization of the Department of Defense and federal agencies. Like to hear more about your views on that specifically.
Yeah, so I started out by talking about what I was seeing in during the riots, with people literally firebombing police and federal buildings and state and county buildings, attacking police, and not having any repercussions from it. There was no accountability that happened. People would get arrested and they would get let out the next day with a check from some of our elected leaders that wanted to promote their behavior, which is absolutely inexcusable. But we're seeing those same kinds of attitudes in other areas, like I mentioned the border, which has had this uncontrolled flood of illegal drugs, violent crime, human trafficking, both sex trafficking and agricultural trafficking, that is pouring across our border and infecting all of our local communities, not just here in Oregon, but all throughout our nation. And so, these are serious issues that we need to get under control. And part of that is by managing what's happening at the border, by having immigration reform. So that way we're actually, we know who's coming into our nation, what they're doing here, why they're here, where they're at. Instead of having, these cartels that are, promising people that they're coming into, a nation of freedom, only to find themselves in slavery. We've seen examples of this down in Southern Oregon, especially, but this is happening all over Oregon, in every community, where these cartels bring people into these grow operations, they're funneling all kinds of drugs across our border, which are, killing mostly kids, younger people. But we also have issues with opioids in our elderly population, which is at epidemic rates. And so, we have these issues of violent crime, illegal drugs, the trafficking pieces that are extremely harmful. And the sex trafficking piece I think people are becoming more aware of it now. I'm currently working on an initiative to go. We won't be able to make it onto the 2022 ballot, but hopefully the 2024 ballot, to shore up some of the human trafficking loopholes that are available that promote trafficking along our I-5 corridor, which is one of the worst in the nation. So it definitely managing those pieces, which are local issues, but they're also federal issues. And, making sure that our national defense is properly in its place. So, we've done a lot in this nation to reduce our ability to manage our security. So one of the primary things that we had done was to become energy independent. And we were at the point where we were actually exporting energy to other nations. And in the last year and a half, that has completely stopped. And now we're reliant on buying oil from regimes like Russia, and now they're talking about Venezuela. And so it puts the American people, who are freedom-loving people, at the onus of these dictatorial regimes.
Yeah,
that
I
are in.
agree.
Yeah.
I agree that this is, it may seem to a lot of Oregonians, especially here in Yamhill County, like, the border security isn't a big deal because we're pretty far north of the border. But what they don't understand is a lot of these issues are here in Oregon, as they are in other parts of the country. I actually get reports from the county sheriff department of arrests and investigations and things like that. There's a lot of deaths from fentanyl here in Yamhill County. And what a lot of people don't understand, especially the users of these drugs, we can have the debate about they're illegally using narcotics, but also at the end of the day, you have these people who are long-term users of heroin, cocaine, meth, things like that. And then they get fentanyl. Sometimes they don't know it's fentanyl. It's advertised to them as being these other drugs, and they use the normal dose that they use for these other drugs, but you use that same dose of fentanyl and it will kill you. It takes like the amount of fentanyl that can literally fit on your fingertip, like your index fingertip. That amount can kill you. So it's a significant problem, in my opinion, even here up in Oregon, in Yamhill County, because I see these deaths that are happening, the arrests, the fentanyl that's being seized, that's been trafficked up here. And you're right. There's also the human trafficking. They're abducting people from around the country, and they're trafficking them. It's all done by the same groups that are selling the drugs. So this is a significant issue.
Yeah. Well, and they're not just taking people from around the country or from other nations. They're taking kids from right here in our own state. And, the average age of abduction or being trafficked is 9 to 12 years old.
Yeah,
and the life expectancy of someone who's been trafficked is only 7 years.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about a large number of kids that go missing, and they're being groomed in schools. They're being groomed in places like the mall. And we talked earlier about the hypersexualization of schools, and by opening kids up to these things at earlier and earlier ages, you're just setting the stage for that grooming to happen much easier, and for these kids to be, talked into these really horrible experiences by these traffickers.
I agree. So the last issue is reinvigorate the economy. And you had 3 subtexts to this. reduce the costs of living for the average American families by removing unnecessary taxes and regulation that drove them up, incentivizing entrepreneurship, and ending the limitless debt ceiling increases. Feel free to elaborate further on what you mean by all this.
Yeah. So we're in a situation now in our nation where we have increased our debt to the point where not just our kids, but our grandkids are going to be paying this off. And that could be eliminated, just like we have in our state a balanced budget addendum. We have to do it. We have to balance our budget. And just like every American, you have to live within your means. Our government, our national government should do the same. And if we were focusing more on that and less on trying to make government bigger and bigger and expanding it into everyone's lives and having a say in everyone's life and what they do, then we would have more than enough money to fund the programs that need to be funded by the federal government. All of that is very much related to what we're experiencing now with the hyperinflation, or with inflation that will soon be hyperinflation, with all of the COVID stimulus monies that we didn't have, but the government just printed money. And any economist can tell you that you start printing money, then you're going to go into hyperinflation. And we're all experiencing what that's like right now, where we're paying almost double what we were paying 2 years ago at the pump, where grocery prices are 30 to 40% higher than they were. And these are things that impact everyday Americans, as being able to feed their families, to get to work in order to feed their families. So we're impacting every aspect of our economic lives and livelihoods of everyday Americans. And so what we're doing is obliterating the middle class. So you're going to end up, if this keeps going in this direction, with the elites and the haves and the have-nots. And one of the things that makes our nation great is that people can start with nothing and rise to extreme success, just based on having drive and hard work and the ability to see where a need is, and that innovation that's sparked by the freedoms that we have in this nation that you don't get in other places. And so, encouraging entrepreneurship, for people to have the ability to see where there's a need and then fill it. It has been what's happening with it's how our nation has grown, and how we have, small business owners are the majority employers in our nation. And right now we're seeing that be destroyed with what's happening with the economic policies of our current administration. So, reducing some of those excessive taxes that, right now here in Oregon, we have the cat tax, which is a tax that gets implemented for every business over a certain amount, but then it's every business throughout the entire supply chain. So it is extremely important that we, and for a lot of business that operate with a very tight margin, that's just enough to push them out of business. So we need to actually promote that entrepreneurship and help, especially like our farmers, which are extremely overregulated. We've damaged our forestry industry here to the point where, now we only have a few large companies where most small logging operations just can't function anymore in our state. And a lot of that has to do with how we're managing the federal forest. So absolutely, there's things that can be done at the national level. We've seen our current sitting senators and congressmen implement regulations that keep our forest from being logged and from for our economy from benefiting from those things. You know, it's our largest renewable resource, and why we're not utilizing that to promote growth in communities where, you know, we used to have communities that were thriving that now have been decimated. So absolutely, there's things that can be done at the national level um, to reverse what's happening. Part of that has to do with getting us back to energy independence, promoting that entrepreneurship, reducing some of the regulations that are harmful, and having common sense regulation. If we're going to have regulation, at least let it be common sense, where we are not harming one avenue to promote another. An example of that would be a lot of what is going on with green energy. You know, green energy is great, but when you're reliant on a product that has been strip mined out of to be produced out of another country, okay, well, that's not happening here, but you're still not helping the environment if you're doing it somewhere else. And then there's all the waste that's going to be produced, because a lot of those forms of energy have very short lifespans. And then you're having to deal with groundwater issues from toxins being leaked into the landfill, wherever those products are going. And you're having the initial strip mining that's being done, not to mention the child labor and all of those other things that we as Americans stand against, but yet we're willing to utilize those products that are being developed in other nations or produced in other nations where those things do exist.
Before we wrap up this interview, is there any other things you'd like the readership of the Yamhill Advocates to know about you and your campaign?
You know, the things that I took from the military are honor, integrity, and service before self. And I have lived my life, my entire adult life, attempting to embody those characteristics. And that's what I'll take with me to Congress, things that we are sorely lacking there right now.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me, and wish you well in your campaign.
Thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. Thanks for having me on.